Welcome to Lecture 1. This lecture would be provided in two parts, Parts 1 and Part 2. You're required to listen to both parts of this lecture for completion. Today's lesson is on the topic Introduction to Disaster Preparedness and Contingency Planning. We will look briefly at a few basic definitions commonly used in disaster management, as well as a brief history of the evolution of disaster management, as well as some of the major trends in disaster management. Let's first look at a definition of disaster, the word disaster. As defined by Black's Law Dictionary, disaster is a calamitous event, especially one occurring suddenly and causing great loss of life, damage, and hardship, such as a flood, an airplane crash, or a business failure. Please note the words in bold. This is intended really to draw your attention to the key components of the definition. You would see me doing this from time to time, so that really would be a hint for you to please note those key words. So again, as the definition says, there are several components. A disaster is defined as a calamitous or a terrible event where certain things would happen. That is, it happens suddenly, there would be great loss of life, there would be damage, and there would be hardship. The word hazard is different from a disaster in that a hazard is a rare and extreme event that may be natural or man-made that can have adverse effects on human life, property, and the environment. So a hazard is not necessarily a disaster. It is an actual event such as a flood, such as a hurricane, but it can then become a disaster if it has a disastrous effect on the environment. An emergency is a term closely related to disaster. However, it is an intense period of a particular disaster where lives and property are at risk. So, emergency is related to a disaster. However, not all stages of a disaster can be described as an intense period where lives and property would be at risk. So that intense period, usually at the beginning of a disaster period, is what we describe as an emergency. For example, that is where you would find that during the early stages of that disaster, response teams are required to go out to try to carry out search and rescue, medical services, emergency medical services, etc. Risk is the probability or the likelihood, such as injury, death, disease, or environmental damage, or loss occurring under certain conditions. So, certain conditions can either increase the risk or probability of bad things happening or decrease according to the type of conditions. For example, flooding risk may be high in an area because the area may be prone to waterlogged soils or prolonged periods of rainfall during the rainy season. Those would be some of the conditions that can lead to high risk or high probability of flooding. Vulnerability. This refers to the inability of certain communities or groups to withstand a particular phenomena, such as a hazard or a disaster. Some conditions in a community, such as poverty, may make a community vulnerable or increasingly vulnerable to disaster. Other conditions that might increase vulnerability may be soil erosion, deforestation, may increase the probability or the likelihood or the vulnerability of a community to landslides. So those were just a few major terms that I would want you to take note of. Now we're going to look at how disaster has evolved through history. It's important for us to note that hazards and disasters as we know them have not always existed. Interestingly enough, as we've already defined hazards or events more particularly, these events have been there since the beginning of human history, such as flooding, earthquakes, etc. However, we need to note that in order to qualify as a hazard, the event must have a negative effect on man's existence. For example, our prehistoric ancestors faced many of the same risks that we face today. However, evidence shows that there had actually been measures that would take place in order to mitigate some of the effects. For example, a very famous story is that of Noah's Ark from the Old Testament of the Bible, where Noah preached that there was going to be this worldwide flood that would destroy the earth. However, knowing that this event, which was the flood, would come, Noah was able to prepare by building the ark in order to save human and animal life. So Noah actually took preemptive measures in order to secure human life. To put this in context, if we were to have an earthquake occurring in the middle of a desert region that is unpopulated, the earthquake would be an event. However, it is not hazardous because there is no human population, there are no cities, no buildings, nothing actually to be harmed or damaged. So this is why it's important for us to understand the context of disasters where hazards or events are concerned. Additionally, when we look back in history, we can see that there were organized emergency responses, such as occurred with the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. This is a volcanic eruption, and history shows that there was an organized response to this event, that many lives were actually saved. Even though lives were lost, many lives were actually saved as a result of the prompt evacuation of much of the population. For those of us who are not aware, Mount Vesuvius is located on the west coast of Italy. So let's now look at the modern roots of disaster management. And it would be interesting to note that many of the disaster management principles that we even practice now, we can trace all the way back to ancient civilizations. For example, the principles of flood control. From 1817 to 1722 BC, that is before Christ. So that would be those years plus the 2018 that we're in right now. So we're looking at almost 4,000 years ago in Egypt, where water wheels were actually used to divert flood waters from the Nile away from the tombs that were located along the river Nile itself. The reason why this was so important is they wanted to protect the tombs from the damage of the flood waters. And the reason for this is because their burial customs was such that they believed that it was necessary to ensure that the burial tombs were preserved and protected to ensure immortality after death. Fighting fires. 2,000 years ago, during the Roman Empire under Emperor Augustus, there was evidence of organized firefighting within the Roman army. So this would actually have been the first recorded evidence of systematic fighting of fires, even as we know them today. These principles have come down to us in terms of emergency management that are used today. Other examples of principles used in disaster management occurred in the 13th and 14th centuries in the Incan civilizations that developed in the Andes of South America, with the use of urban planning. So if you look at the photo to the right, you can see an overhead photo of the fortress of Machu Picchu. Clearly there is organized settlement there, and this organized settlement clearly shows where there is human intervention in terms of how the land is being used. You can see the gridded patterns, you can the gridded patterns of the built settlements, as well as the way in which the land is being used. If you look closely, you can actually see some terracing occurring there, and all of this was intended to try to minimize the risk of disaster such as landslides in those hilly areas. Additionally, reduction of starvation could be seen in India during the late 19th century, where there was evidence of collaboration between the British and Indian governments to reduce starvation during drought periods. This was done through the development of the railway system, where they were able to transport food vast distances via the railway system. That being said, let us look now at what we would call the paradigm shift in terms of thinking with regards to disaster management. A few decades ago, disasters were viewed as one-off events. That is, meaning that these events would occur that seemed to happen out of nowhere. They seemed to have no relationship to anything else. And as a result, government and relief agencies would respond to disasters accordingly. They would respond to disasters based on the event itself and really not look at causes. So we would describe this type of response as reactive. Eventually, there was a change in attitude that shifted to an emphasis on preparedness measures. So this preparedness or preparation for disasters essentially focused heavily on preparation in terms of relief in terms of the immediate response to a disaster. So that's providing emergency supplies, food, housing, etc., water, etc. So many of the disaster management programs that we have now are now properly planned and financed so that relief could be provided. Some of the international agencies that sprung up out of this move were, for example, the Red Cross. Now I want you to follow closely with me in this schematic that looks at the evolution of this thinking in disaster management. So as mentioned before, we start at the top with the reactive response, where we highlighted before that disasters were treated as one-off events. Then we move to the stage where the focus was on preparedness. And as I mentioned before, this preparedness often involved the stockpiling of relief goods for the response to the emergency. So the immediate needs of survivors would be provided for. This eventually evolved to another stage that we call the technical stage, or the technocratic thinking in terms of disaster management. This was where science and technology was now beginning to really take off and be involved in a major way in disaster management, where public policy often involved the application of engineering solutions to disaster management. For example, the building of seawalls and flood walls to protect areas from flooding, and other sorts of engineering feats in order to to protect communities and areas from disaster. Then, as we continue to gain knowledge and understanding of our environment, there was now the intervention of vulnerability analysis in terms of disaster management. For example, from the realization that people's vulnerability is a key factor, this was now integrated into the way in which we manage disasters, where managers would look at what is it about a community, what conditions exist there that might make them more susceptible to certain types of disasters, such as flooding, such as earthquakes, etc. For example, a community or a country may be vulnerable to earthquakes because they are geographically located in an earthquake zone. And then eventually, disaster management progressed to the stage of risk management. And risk management effectively integrates all of these previous principles and approaches in order to prepare for management, in order to enhance disaster management capacity of any community or any nation. So if we were to look at this simple schematic, we can see that there are three major components that we need to pay attention to if we want to determine risk in any area. We have to look at the hazard and determine what is the hazard and what is the danger involved with the hazard, such as an earthquake. What is the exposure to the hazard? A community or a nation, as I said previously, may be exposed to the earthquake hazard because of their geographic location. Then the third factor we would need to look at would be vulnerability, or in other words, your ability to cope with that hazard. So a country may be exposed to earthquakes because of their geographic location, but they may have a high capacity to cope with it, such as what had happened in 2011 with the earthquake in Chile. Whereas in Haiti of the same year, Haiti's vulnerability was very high, or in other words, their capacity to cope was very low because of their particular localized conditions. So therefore, that is where Haiti and Chile varied. They varied in terms of their capacity to cope, whereas the hazard and exposure were the same. So as a result, Haiti's risk was high, Chile's were moderate. So as you know, there are essentially two major categories of hazards. We have natural hazards, and many of our natural hazards you'd be familiar with. We have mentioned some of them before, such as earthquakes. In our part of the world, and in particular Trinidad and Tobago, we are highly vulnerable to earthquakes. We are vulnerable to hurricanes. Some parts of the Caribbean are also vulnerable to volcanic eruptions. And also, because of the geographic location of where our islands are located, that would also make us vulnerable to tsunamis, because tsunamis are often related to underwater earthquakes or even volcanic eruptions taking place. We also have many man-made hazards, and again, Trinidad and Tobago are vulnerable to many of these man-made hazards. For example, we have risk of industrial accidents occurring because of our heavy petroleum industry emphasis. We have risk of other types of hazards, as you could see in the photo, the bottom left, that appears to be forest fires. Because of the dry season, we often are at risk to many of these forest fires. And if you are aware, the fire services and even the Division of Forestry often tell us every year that almost 100% of those forest fires are caused by man. The photo at the bottom right, that is an example of a man-made hazard where war and civil strife is concerned. Oftentimes war would lead to destruction of the environment and the harm to human life. At this point, I would ask you to please refer to part 2 of this lecture. This lecture would be provided in video form as well. Thank you for being a part of today's lesson.